If you ask me my favorite place on Earth, I'll probably say here. Washington's North Cascades are often referred to as the American Alps on account of their resemblance to the European Alps. Jagged peaks, turquoise lakes, sprawling alpine meadows. But what keeps me coming back to the Cascades is what makes them so unlike the Alps. They're empty. Walking around here feels like walking through a museum. An exhibit on how volcanoes, glaciers, forests, and water all work in harmony, and a place that has been remarkably preserved as a living laboratory for scientists and a rare example of pristine alpine wilderness. I want to tell you a fascinating story about what makes these mountains so special, about the volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods that built them, but just as much about how we didn't destroy them, about how they managed to survive the fastest period of American expansion, and the scientists and artists whose work here inspired a new relationship with the outdoors. The Cascade Range lies right along a tectonic plate boundary. The Juan de Fuca Plate in the Pacific is slowly sliding under the North American Plate on land, melting the rock deep below and allowing magma to surface, forming huge volcanoes all along the coast. A handful are visible today, 7 of which have erupted in the last few centuries. The largest, Tahoma, is older, about 1 million or so years. Kolshan, in the northern end of the range, is on the younger side, the current mountain as young as just 50,000 years. The landscape here feels more volcanic, made mostly of old lava flows. It's also more active, most recently erupting in 1843. Other Cascade volcanoes have erupted more recently and more violently, most famously Lewitt in 1980. But those are just the tip of the natural disaster iceberg. As these plates slide past each other, friction between them causes earthquakes. The plates slowly build up tension for centuries before violently snapping back into place, triggering a massive earthquake on the coast, which triggers a massive tsunami in the Pacific. Earthquakes here are among the strongest on Earth, but they only happen every several hundred years, the most recent in 1700. Indigenous stories tell of mountains shaking and the ocean swallowing the land, and Japanese records tell of a mysterious orphan tsunami with no earthquake preceding it. That tsunami had originated in the northwest and crossed the Pacific to reach Japan. In the time since the 1700 earthquake, people from further east have colonized the northwest, building large cities along the coast. And researchers from those cities have uncovered evidence of the impending natural disaster right underneath them. That friction between the plates is also causing the edge of the continent to fold like an accordion, pushing the Cascade and Olympic mountains higher and the Puget Sound lower. After this plate boundary pushed these mountains into the air, ice carved them down into the jagged peaks you see today. Over the last couple million years, glacial periods have sculpted the landscape, the most recent beginning 18,000 years ago and gradually burying the Northwest under thousands of feet of ice. In Idaho, ice dammed the Clark Fork River, forming a massive lake covering much of Montana. The dam would occasionally break, spilling insane amounts of water into the Cascades in the largest floods ever studied, rapidly altering the landscape and helping to carve the 4,000-foot-deep Columbia River Gorge. Between 10 and 12,000 years ago, the ice sheet retreated, leaving behind the most glaciated mountains in the contiguous US and allowing people from Eurasia to cross into North America and populate the valleys below. The North Pacific coast features mild climates and tons of rain and fog, conditions that keep forest fires at bay and allow for the growth of ginormous old trees and lush, biodiverse rainforests blanketing most of the region. Between the icy peaks and the lush valleys are alpine meadows, grassy landscapes dotted with lakes, patches of trees, and fields of colorful wildflowers, highly sensitive landscapes reflecting both the rugged isolation above and the biodiversity below. Indigenous groups have inhabited the Cascades for thousands of years. They gave the volcanoes names: Tahoma, Lewitt, and Kolshan, the Great White Peak. And they gave them stories, great fights between the mountains, throwing rocks at each other and destroying entire forests. These communities adapted to the rough terrain, harvesting food and medicine from alpine meadows during the summer and taking refuge in the valleys during the winter. The mountainous landscape of the Cascades provided protection from the elements, but later from colonization. In June of 1792, Spanish colonists sailed into the Salish Sea, writing of lights and bursts of flame from Colchon to the east. At the same time, George Vancouver of the British Royal Navy was leading an expedition mapping the northwest coast, accompanied by 3rd Lieutenant Joseph Baker. Vancouver was well connected back in Britain, with people like Admiral Lord Samuel Hood, Baron St. Helens, and Rear Admiral Peter Rainier. 13 years later, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led a U.S. expedition across the northwest, passing through the Columbia River Gorge and naming the surrounding mountains after the hundreds of cascades that flow into the gorge. Throughout the 1800s, more white Americans started working their way into the Cascades, but the rugged terrain slowed expansion considerably. Early expeditions were limited to the major rivers and mountain passes, and the area opened to homesteaders in 1846, but was hardly used until the late 1870s. The qualities that make the Cascades so beautiful also made them vulnerable. In the late 1800s, big trees meant logging, big rivers meant dams, and big mountains meant mining. The 1800s brought thousands of people to the Cascades, most of them seeking to exploit the landscape for profit. But a few had different intentions. The first non-indigenous people to venture onto Mount Rainier were mountaineers. Among the first was someone you might recognize, John Muir. He wrote an essay about the ascent, describing glaciers covered with crevasses and ice cliffs, and recounting a dangerous journey to the top of what he called the Noble King Mountain, rising in godlike majesty over the woods, like a separate, newborn world. Muir explored and wrote about the Northwest extensively, about the most extravagantly beautiful of alpine meadows, about vast forests with trees 400 feet high, about the largest peaks and their glaciers. Muir's writing helped inspire ideas of conserving the landscape rather than exploiting it, new ideas for people who looked like him. He pushed for the protection of Mount Rainier as a national park in a lobbying effort alongside scientists, mountaineers, conservationists, businesses, and railroads, stressing not just the tourism potential, but the unmatched beauty of the landscape and the need to preserve the glaciers for future study. In 1899, Mount Rainier became the country's 5th national park, and its first debate over the balance between conservation and recreation. Park visitation just blew up in the first few decades, and development had a hard time keeping up. By the 1920s, people were already complaining about crowds in the main areas. During the Great Depression, the park tried new developments to attract more visitors. A new visitor center, a golf course, ski areas. Today, Rainier is one of the most popular parks in the country, and most off-trail areas are closed for restoration following decades of overuse. By the 1960s, industry had expanded much further into the Cascades. A few lucky areas like Rainier were protected as national parks, but almost all of what remained had been logged, mined, dammed, or populated, with one big exception. The Cascade Range is about 60 miles wide, but this area in the north is closer to 160 miles wide and features some of the Cascades' most rugged terrain, slowing the expansion of colonists into the mountains and preserving this region as one of the last relatively untouched areas in the country, the North Cascades. This was the most glaciated section of the Cascade Range and also contained some of the largest sections of old-growth forest in the contiguous US. Unlike Rainier, it hadn't been turned into a tourist attraction and remained largely unknown and untouched. But that didn't guarantee safety. The area was managed by the Forest Service as a multiple-use area, allowing for logging, dams, and mining. In October of 1963, the North Cascades Conservation Council publishes the Prospectus for a North Cascades National Park. It condemns the failure of the Forest Service to protect the landscape and proposes a transfer of the North Cascades to the National Park Service, ending all logging, damming, and mining, along with the creation of multiple wilderness areas, sealing these mountains off from development and preserving them for future generations. The proposal stresses that the crises facing the conservation movement have reached points of no return, and that this is perhaps the last opportunity to create new parks and protect new wilderness. Hearings are held to gather public opinion on a North Cascades park. Only 45% of those attending support protection of the area, many of them science teachers and professors from nearby, with quotes like, "With the North Cascades, we have an area that should be protected and preserved at all costs. The area includes the greatest natural alpine laboratories in the country. The combination of topography, altitude, climate, geological formations, geographic position, and minimal man-made disturbance have contrived to evolve a biological province which cannot be duplicated. We need to fight for the preservation of natural beauties, for the savage will destroy them if he can. Block it up so that the greedy, the thoughtless, and short-sighted cannot rob the boys and girls of the future of their classroom, laboratory, and spiritual inspiration. Recreation is the resource available in the North Cascades that far exceeds in value any of the commercial aspects simply because it applies to people and their feelings. The most important aspect of people is whether or not they enjoy life." Opposition is just as loud, coming primarily from nearby industries and chambers of commerce, protesting the business opportunities lost by protecting land. In this New York Times editorial, the spokesman for the Washington State Game Department is quoted saying that a North Cascades National Park would be, quote, "nothing more than an outdoor museum." And honestly, he couldn't be more right. This place is like a museum on how the Earth works. You can see firsthand how volcanoes and tectonic plates build mountains, how their glaciers support the alpine meadows and rainforests below, and how those meadows and forests become havens for biodiversity. In 1964, the Wilderness Act passed, establishing the Wilderness Protection System and protecting 3 wilderness areas in Washington state. In 1968, North Cascades National Park was established, and over the next 20 years, about a dozen more designations were added to the quilt of wilderness areas that make up arguably the best protected place in the contiguous U.S. After the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, Congress designated it the first national volcanic monument, an untouched area which became the site of groundbreaking research about eruptions and their aftermath. And deeper in the mountains, glaciers and old-growth forests provide a living laboratory for biology and geology, just as John Muir predicted over a century ago. Today, glaciers continue to move, forests continue to evolve, volcanoes continue to erupt, and these tectonic plates continue to slide. This landscape is a work in progress, and so is its protection. I see this as a rare story where conservation wins, but also a reminder not to get complacent or take these places for granted. In hindsight, protecting Tahoma and the North Cascades seems so obvious. But decades ago, these were areas of intense debate, often with louder opposition than support. What are we debating today? What decisions are we making that generations after us will look back on and say it was so obvious to do what we did? Or so obvious that we should have done more?